L'UNESCO nel 2021 dichiara i portici di Bologna patrimonio dell'umanità. Modestamente, io e i miei amici l'avevamo capito a 6 anni, quando sotto i portici giocavamo a nascondino. Non avremmo saputo dirlo, però lo sentivamo che quei 62 chilometri di portici rappresentano un caso unico di spazio intermedio fra dentro e fuori. Sotto i portici sei in strada, ma anche in casa. Sei fuori, ma sei dentro. All'aperto, ma col tetto sopra. Se piove non ti bagni e se c'è il sole stai all'ombra. Ti senti protetto e circondato dal mistero allo stesso tempo. I portici sono l'origine della tradizionale socialità bolognese. In quel curioso mix tra mondo e casa è più facile conoscersi, chiacchierare, discutere, litigare, corteggiare. Il portico crea uno spazio naturalmente teatrale. I suoi giochi di luce sembrano sempre allestiti da un direttore della fotografia. Per questo fare belle foto sotto i portici è facilissimo. Ci riescono tutti. Nel 1100 a Bologna c'era la prima università del mondo. La gente quindi costruiva stanze sporgenti da affittare agli studenti, ma ogni tanto le sporgenze crollavano. Si iniziarono a costruire colonne per tenerle su. Nel 1288 la città rese i portici obbligatori. I proprietari di case dovevano costruirli a loro spese sul proprio terreno. L'altezza minima era fissata per legge: un uomo a cavallo, col cappello. I portici sono quindi uno spazio ibrido tra pubblico e privato. Hanno un proprietario, ma sono di tutti. Per regolare queste contraddizioni, nei secoli sono uscite centinaia di leggi che hanno definito un prototipo urbano di bene comune. Per questo i portici sono dappertutto, in centro, in periferia, in collina. Quindi grazie UNESCO per questo riconoscimento importantissimo. Però scusate, ho una critica. Perché nelle motivazioni non dite che con tutte quelle colonne i portici di Bologna sono il posto perfetto per giocare a nascondino? Bologna, Emilia-Romagna, Italia.
Buonasera, my name is Lillo Guarneri. I'm the director of Italian Culture Institute. As most of you already know, the Istituto Italiano di Cultura is the cultural office of the Consulate General of Italy, whose mission is the promotion of Italian language and culture through the organization of courses and cultural events. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing restriction imposed by the COVID pandemic, most of our exciting events had to be moved to an online format once again. The topic of tonight's webinar makes us Italians particularly proud, as it focuses on the recent inclusion of the Porticos of Bologna into the UNESCO World Heritage List. Italy holds the records for the most heritage sites in the world, 59 sites already recognized by UNESCO, such as the Historical Center of Florence and Naples, the Amalfi Coast, the Dolomites, Mount Etna, etc. This year, also the 14th century fresco cycle of the Giotto Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, north of Italy, has been also awarded. Italy has also several entries in the so-called intangible cultural heritage, which include performing arts, festival, language, and traditional craft. For example, the work of Sicilian Opera dei Pupi, the Master Luther in Cremona, the Mediterranean diet, the art of pizzaiolo in Naples, etc. The Porticos Bologna run through the city for 62 kilometers, and they have been recognized by UNESCO as a unicum, not only from an architectural point of view, but also from a social perspective, so important nowadays. In this presentation, cultural historian Catherine Holland will follow the city's walkway, contextualizing their genesis and explain the history of the sites they connect. Following the presentation, art historian Michael Hill will explore important elements of Italy's urban development and what they can tell us about how Italians build and live in their beautiful villages, town, and city. Bologna is also located very close to Parma, a city that has paid particular attention to the environment and sustainability. In this context, I would like to mention that between the 28th of September and 14th of October, Parma hosts the 5th edition of the Festival dello Sviluppo Sostenibile, Festival of Sustainable Development. The festival was established 5 years ago, following the drafting of the United Nations 2030 Agenda, and will present hundreds of events all over Italy, both in presence and online. If you wish to find out more, you can visit our website where you can find the link to the festival. And now let's welcome Dr. Catherine Holev. Thank you all.
Grazie Lillo. Thank you very much to the Italian Institute of Culture for this opportunity to speak about Bologna, which is a city that Michael and I have a particular soft spot for, so it'll be a real pleasure for us to be able to talk about that with you tonight. And it's lovely just to have a general opportunity to celebrate the Italian contributions to culture around the world, which I think is something that all of us here tonight share an interest in and a burning desire to get back overseas to experience fully as soon as we possibly can. So let me just share my screen with you, and hopefully now you can all see the images that Michael and I are going to be talking about tonight. Before I start a canter through Bologna's history, putting some of the 62 kilometres of Porticos into a physical context in that history, I just wanted to let you know that you can send through any questions that you have for Michael and myself using the chat function on Zoom. So you'll see that you have restricted ability to chat, and we'd prefer it if you send any questions about the presentation to me. But if they do by accident go through to anyone else in the chat who's nominated as someone that you can send messages to, they will find their way to me or to Michael. So please do send through any questions or comments that you might have about the presentation, because due to the size of the event, we've had to limit your ability to unmute and ask any questions. So please use that chat freely. But what I want to do now is offer a brief introduction to the history of the city of Bologna and give you an idea of how it is that the Porticos, this system and unicum, as UNESCO has recognised and as Lillo pointed out in his presentation, how that developed across the history of the city. And I think Bologna is a city that perhaps Australians are less familiar with. Unfairly so. I would really encourage you, when you can, travel again to Italy to spend some time in Bologna. It's a city that opens itself up the longer you spend there, which I suppose is true of most cities as a traveller, but it's particularly true of Bologna. And Bologna has some epithets that you may have heard. You may have heard it referred to as Bologna la Grassa, Bologna the Fat. And unfortunately, we won't be speaking about that element of Bologna tonight, which maybe is a good thing, given that some of you may not have had your dinner yet. We won't whet your appetite too much with a description of Bologna's proud food history. It's also known as Bologna la Rossa, perhaps because of its red roof tiles, perhaps because of its left-leaning political history in the modern era, and it's also known as Bologna la Dotta, or Bologna the Learned, and that's due to its very proud history in terms of the university. So we'll touch on some of those aspects, but not the food, I'm afraid, not the presentation for food, if that's what you've come for. But Bologna has a very rich cultural history in Italy, located in the centre of Italy. It's in an area that has been settled over the millennia by various groups. It has, in fact, excellent documentation, archaeological documentation of a cultural group that we don't know much about other than what we find in Bologna. That's the Villanovan culture. And you can see there that that group of people settled in the region of Bologna by at least the 10th century BCE. They then cohabited a century later, a millennium later, they began to cohabit with the Etruscans, who settled in this area as well, as they did in much of central northern Italy. And in fact, the two produced together, while they lived alongside one another, a very interesting mixed culture that you can still see fine records of, particularly in Bologna's archaeological museum, which is a real treasure, something I'd highly recommend if you do find yourself in Bologna. And by the way, pre-pandemic, airlines like Emirates were flying into Bologna as one of their major airports in Italy. So it's actually much easier to get to Bologna now than it has been in the past. And then eventually the Etruscans held sway in this area of Bologna. They founded a city in the region they'd been settling in that they called Feltzna, which in fact is where we get yet another epithet for the city of Bologna. It's been known since antiquity as Felsina, and you'll even sometimes see it proudly celebrated as Felsina today. Felsina was the Latin pronunciation for Feltzna, this original Etruscan name for the city. And we have fantastic records of the Etruscan period of Bologna's history. You've been looking here at an extraordinary cinerary urn in bronze that was in fact excavated next to one of the porticos we'll show you and talk about, and that's the portico next to the modern cemetery of Bologna, which is at the Certosa. So this is an extraordinary work of smithing that was excavated in Bologna and can still be seen in the Archaeological Museum today. And if you travel not far outside of the city of Bologna to a town called Marzabotto, we have really one of the best examples of an Etruscan settlement anywhere in Italy. So we have great examples of grave goods, for example, of the Etruscan civilization in central northern Italy. But this is a place where we can actually see what Etruscan town planning looked like. We have the remains of a town that was essentially rebuilt from scratch by the Etruscans in the 5th century BCE with a great documentation of structures. So Bologna has this very long history reaching back into the far past, but then it also has a modern history, which is particularly interesting as well. So not far from this archaeological site, for example, at Marzabotto, and some of you may be more familiar with this place for the modern event that I'm about to describe. In fact, during World War II, there was one of the most severe reprisals of Nazis against Italian partisans that took place not far from this archaeological site, with over 700 Italian civilians killed in that event. So Bologna has this very long history that we can document way back into the BCE era, but it also has this sustained modern engagement in the development of Italian's modern history, which is something that was recognised in the UNESCO World Heritage Listing. Bologna is very centrally located. This is part of the reason why the Villanovans settled in the plains here, why the Etruscans settled here, and then the Romans become interested in the area as well. It's an area that had 2 good river systems, which in antiquity was the main way of getting around, moving people and goods. The easiest way to do that was on rivers. So Bologna was well connected to rivers, and then it becomes very well connected thanks to the construction of the Via Emilia, which is the line that you have here in brown, running from present-day Rimini to present-day Piacenza. And Bologna, or Bononia, as it was known in its Roman era, was located directly on that road. So it's quite easy to get to and from Bologna from other major Roman settlements. And this meant that when the Romans settled this area, when they took over the settlement that the Etruscans had built of Feltzna, Bologna becomes a quite prominent city for them. And there are, again, excellent remains that are documented of the Roman period of Bologna's history. The entire town plan was redesigned at this point in time, which is something, again, that the city preserves to this day. It still has as at its core that Roman street plan, again, something acknowledged in the UNESCO listing, the way in which the modern city has continued to occupy the ancient site. So much so that if you go into the Central Bologna Tourist Office, which is located in one of the city's beautiful public libraries, this is the Biblioteca Salaborza, if you go down underneath those perspex, those transparent squares that you can see in the ground floor of the communal library, what you'll find down in the basement is ruins, substantial ruins of roads and buildings from that Roman period of Bologna's history. And if you go to the Archaeological Museum, which is something I'd highly commend, not only will you see wonderful Etruscan remains like the situla that I started with, but you'll also see wonderful examples of Roman statuary, like this, for example, and other Roman artifacts from this period, which really show us how prominent this city was for Rome, how important and significant its population was. But with the breakdown of the Empire of Rome, Bologna becomes really ripe for the picking from waves of so-called invaders, other groups of people looking for territory that they can inhabit and food with which to feed their growing populations. And so Bologna is repeatedly sacked by the Goths, and we have, in fact, a local bishop who, in this period, in fact, reorganizes the city during the so-called Dark Ages in order to better defend itself. He reorganizes it with the church as a principal form of civic organization, and he's still recognized as the local saint of Bologna. So this is San Petronio, who you're seeing here in a wonderful detail from an altarpiece by a fabulous local artist, Francesco del Cossa. Highly recommend him to you. He painted this in the 15th century. And if you want to know more about Francesco del Cossa, there's a wonderful novel by Ali Smith called How to Be Both, which I would also highly recommend to you. And here you see San Petronio, in fact, holding a model of the city of Bologna, which he was designed to protect, both as a patron saint, but which he did actually protect as a bishop. And he, in fact, founded a complex of churches that is still one of the most important medieval sites in Bologna, and that's the complex of Santo Stefano, sometimes known as the Sette Chiese, because as you can see from that agglomeration of buildings, within this complex, there are in fact 7 churches around which you can do a virtual pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Holy Sepulchre. So in fact, it's also sometimes known as Santa Gerusalemme, and these are some of the most beautiful and carefully planned medieval buildings that we have. In the earliest buildings here, we have buildings dating from the so-called Dark Ages right down to their rebuilding in the 14th century. So this is yet another extraordinary site. So there's this difficult period in the Dark Ages, but then there's an opportunity for Bologna to reinvent itself. And that opportunity is presented by a very difficult political struggle that really racks and roils the entire Italian peninsula in the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries. And this is a struggle between the growing power of the Pope in Rome and the Holy Roman Emperor to the north about who can tax the inhabitants of a city. Is it the bishop who receives a tithe, or is it the emperor who taxes his citizens? And this is simplifying the question, but it was such a complicated question that lawyers were needed to investigate the ecclesiastical, the canon law code, and the civil law code in order to reach a deliberation about where taxes would go, who could mint their own coins, who could levy duties and imposts. They sound like minor matters, but they control the city's finances, and they might also control the fate of your soul. So these were really important questions. And this is, in fact, where we have the origin of Bologna University, is lawyers setting out to investigate canon law and civil law in order to really resolve this question of the so-called investiture controversy. And Bologna is still very proudly the world's oldest continually operating university. You have the center of the present day university around the area of Via Zamboni, where you see porticos. Here's your first portico. Porticos such as this one on Via Zamboni. These were used by students over the centuries as a type of open air salon where they could gather and have important conversations. I think we all remember as students that some of our most important and interesting conversations took place outside of the classroom, perhaps rather than inside it. So you can imagine how porticos such as these in the university district really sponsor that kind of conversation. And today they sponsor art forms as well. So Bologna has a modest mural trail, murales as they're known in Italy, of quite frequently politically motivated works that decorate the area of Bologna University as well. And also the usual scourge of tagging that afflicts most areas where students are, which was something that in fact did cause some concern in terms of the UNESCO submission, how to deal with this issue of tagging in a university town. So Bologna University today is centred in the area around Via Zamboni, but when it began, it was mostly masters holding private lessons in their houses. So the centralised part of the university, as we think of Bologna University today, that really grew from the 16th century, as we'll see later, with papal, particularly thanks to papal support and papal financial investment. But from its earliest origins in the 11th century, it was a really dispersed group of students living with their professors quite frequently, which is an interesting thing to consider. No getting out of doing your homework, getting your essay in on time when you live with your professor, but we'll see in fact that caused a bit of a housing crisis as the university grew, in fact. And Bologna, I said to you, one of its epithets is Bologna la Rossa. And in fact, that idea of it being the red city is tied as well to the thematic of Bologna's active political engagement. And in such a strong university town, you can see that there is still this strong political engagement. Add political struggle to your study plan, for example. And also here we see a tagger climbing up the two symbols of Bologna from its medieval period, which you saw briefly on the screen before, known as Le Due Torri, two very, very frighteningly leaning towers in the centre of Bologna. Here you can see the tagger climbing the burning towers to keep tagging away. So this was something that did exercise a little bit of concern in terms of the UNESCO submission. Bologna in the Middle Ages was a really populous city, a population of up to 60,000 people. That makes it, for that period, one of the largest cities in Western Europe. So it grows on the one hand thanks to this growing education institution in the university. On the other hand, it's growing thanks to industry, particularly textiles and even more particularly silk textile production, which Bologna becomes a centre of in the Middle Ages. And this is a reconstruction of just how strongly defensive the city was in terms of its private citizens and families seeking to defend themselves and the positions they've gained for their families through the construction of private towers, some of which remain. So in the case of Le Due Torri, which you can in fact see in the centre here. By the way, this is a screenshot of something that you can do in the Museum of the History of the City of Bologna, quite a mouthful. Palazzo Pepoli is where you want to go for that, where they give you little virtual reality headset that you put on and you literally fly through these towers. I've done it. It's quite dizzying. You fly around the towers, you walk the streets of the medieval city. A donkey and a cart actually drive through you, which is a little bit disconcerting, but it's an amazing way to experience what it was like to live in a medieval, really bustling medieval city such as this one. But if like me, virtual reality can leave you a little nauseated and discombobulated, an easier way to see the medieval centre of Bologna is to take a peek through the so-called Finestrella on Via Piella, which is this little, quite literally a hole in a wall that has been cut to allow people to see the medieval canal system that used those two rivers I mentioned to bring water into the city in order to sustain the population, but particularly to sustain industry. So thanks to the university and thanks to silk in particular, Bologna in the Middle Ages thrives. But this means that it faces a population crisis. It needs to house people from the countryside who quite naturally, when they see that jobs, when they see that protection, where they see that really comprehensive spiritual and physical care, that these things are all available within the protective circuit of a city, what we tend to see is people moving into cities in order to improve their conditions of life. So on the one hand, in the Middle Ages in Bologna, we see the usual Italian trend, which is a mass migration into cities, a population explosion, an urban population explosion. But in Bologna, that's intensified by the arrival of all of these students who are coming to study in the homes, remember, of their masters before the university gets centralised buildings. And so the theory goes that in fact, from perhaps the 12th century, the porticos emerge as simply structures to allow private families to capitalize on public space and offer extra housing, whether that's to students or to immigrants into the city, but that this is a way for Bolognese families to offer additional accommodation. They don't own the land that the portico sits over. They don't own the land that the beams rest on, not initially. This situation will change. But when they build up and above that public land on streets, for example, they can use that space to offer extra accommodation. And this is something that happens all over Italy in the Middle Ages. So this is still Bologna. These images are all Bologna, but you might be familiar with structures like these, which are known as sporti, these supporting struts. Some of them still survive in central Florence. You'll find them in Venice, for example. It's a way for public space to be capitalized on by private citizens. And there are some great examples of those very early medieval structures that are designed to claw back a little bit of public space for private benefit that survive in Bologna. What's interesting in Bologna, well, first of all, what's interesting is that these really early medieval examples survive. So in many other Italian cities, the city was developed in a later moment, and we don't see so many great examples of these medieval structures surviving. But what's also interesting is that throughout the rest of central northern Italy, buildings such as this was seen as a legal speculation, and it was discouraged. And it was discouraged because it was seen as detracting from the common good. And this is something that Michael will return to later, so I won't spend much time on that. But in Bologna, these structures, in a kind of a volte-face, the town council consciously reapproaches these illegal structures. And from about 1288, it says, actually, these offer a common good. They offer a private good to the people who get to rent those rooms out up above the public walkway, but they offer a common good to the people who can be sheltered from the rain. You know, it snows in Bologna sometimes, who can exercise their profession in outdoors where, you know, their honesty is never in doubt. Everyone can see how they conduct their profession, but they're also covered from the elements as well. So in fact, the town council of Bologna requires after 1288 that people who are developing, renovating, expanding their houses, that they do consider adding this structure of a portico or a covered walkway on ground that we might think of as public space, as a way to facilitate the movement of people around the city. So it's in the Middle Ages that the porticos first emerge. Bologna in the Renaissance does not share the same kind of Renaissance history as cities like Florence and Venice and Rome, with which you may be more familiar. It has a dalliance with despotism in the Renaissance, a particular family known as the Bentivoglio. Here they are with all of their sons and all of their daughters. I never remember the number, but something like 11. So they were very, very prolific. They want you to know that they're not going anywhere in a hurry. And so in the Renaissance, most people don't go to Bologna for its Renaissance history. They go for the Middle Ages or the university or the food. And I would say, just a word to the wise, next time don't neglect the Renaissance, because there are wonderful examples from this period of Bologna's history too. But what you'll be more familiar with from this period in Bologna as you walk around the city as a visitor today is a transformation in the porticos. So the government has said these are now obligatory. Families must build porticos, covered walkways when they develop and expand their houses. And in the Renaissance, we see another transformation, which is a transformation from materials that are impermanent, like those extraordinary, 9-meter high beams of wood. This is essentially an oak tree supporting the house that you see here, with modern brick supports added later in the 20th century to support the structure. In the Renaissance, what we see in Bologna is a movement towards more permanent materials, particularly with a classical bent, so that drive to classicize, to revive the ancient past that we tend to find in Italy in the period of the Renaissance. So we see beautiful monolithic stone columns in the porticos. We see very fine brick columns. You know, these are materials that won't burn. Hopefully they're going to be a little bit more permanent in the rare earthquakes that do strike Bologna. My mother and I were in Bologna on the day of the last earthquake, so earthquakes do happen in Bologna. But this is probably the Renaissance Bologna that you'll be most familiar with if you visit the city today, the beautiful spaces created by the imposing Renaissance structures of the portico that I'll leave for us to discuss in their architectural sense a little later. And as Stefano Corsi says in that 2.5-minute summation of what Michael and I are trying to do in 1 hour, he says in that introduction that you saw to begin with that it's impossible to take a bad photo in the porticos. And so these beautiful long alleys of space that are created by this sober and imposing Renaissance aesthetic, sometimes in really ingenious ways. You know, these are brick columns that have been covered with a terracotta. I've written stucco, but it's actually terracotta in this case. And then the terracotta has been molded and sculpted in just extraordinary ways. This is a free sculpted capital in terracotta from that portico that I just showed you with the terracotta stuccoed brick. And this one, it's believed, may actually have been carved by Bologna's first significant or second significant woman artist, and that's a woman named Properzia dei Rossi, because another feather, an intangible feather in Bologna's cap is that it produced more women artists than any other Italian city. So Bologna is a very interesting place. Terracotta is a local medium that you will find in other places in Bologna. It's something that doesn't survive in large quantities in terms of its artistic benefit because it's such a fragile medium. But if you do go to Bologna, you must go and look at this extraordinary polychrome life-sized terracotta sculptural group in a church called Santa Maria della Vita. So we see these beautiful, imposing materials like stone, but we also see humble materials like brick and terracotta being transformed into these very elegant and graceful structures in the Renaissance when the porticos become very permanent, no longer just humble wood. Bologna's situation changes from the 16th century because it becomes, with the exception of a really brief interim, it becomes part of the Papal States. It becomes part of the political and spiritual territory of the Pope in Rome. And there's long been an argument that this stifles free debate in Bologna for quite some centuries. This is a period in which the church is beginning to reform itself and reform how it practices the liturgy and celebrates its beliefs in art as well. But what's also true, what's also undeniable is the way in which the popes from the 16th century invest in the fabric of the city of Bologna. So here we have a view, for example, of a big square that was carved out in the center of Bologna, one of its most famous squares today. This is now known as the Piazza Del Neptuno because of the sculpture in the middle of the square, sculpted by Gian Bologna. And this is something that if you visited Bologna, you'll always be taken to see. And this square was a space that the popes carved out, a kind of a stage for their power in the city. No porticos, even from the Middle Ages, could be constructed in this area because it was such a central political space. It had to be left as a political space where the ruler of the town could be easily defended. And so roads lined with porticos might stop people from amassing in a square. And so we have a large open space here without that kind of enclosed portico surround in this part of the city. The popes invested in people who were in Bologna as well. If you've been to Bologna, you'll know that some works of Michelangelo's survive from the period that he lived and worked in Bologna. Unfortunately, his 11-foot statue in bronze of Pope Julius II was later turned into scrap. But certainly the popes invest in great minds and great artists in Bologna. And they do also invest in the fabric of the university. So if you visited Bologna, you'll be taken to this building, the Archiginnasio, and you'll be told about it as the kind of center of the university. But remember, the university was originally just masters teaching in their own houses. And it's not until the time of the popes in the 16th century that the two schools of education at the university, that was law and arts, were united under the same roof of the Archiginasio building. So it's the popes who invest in that building and who invest in a very long portico that runs the entire length of the Archiginasio. As you can see here, you're looking at the back of not the cathedral, but the most prominent church in Bologna, San Petronio. We have this very, very long portico built on the site of a temporary silk fair that would be held every year from the Middle Ages in this place, which has given its name to this portico. This is the extension of the portico still running down the other side. It runs the whole flank of the church of San Petronio. This is still the Portico del Pavallione in the Piazza Maggiore, which is the central square of the city of Bologna outside the church of San Petronio. So it was a significant investment from the Pope's monolithic stone columns, pink marble paving, and it's still a very imposing and comfortable at the same time space in the city today. Certain families in the city of Bologna became more and more powerful thanks to the prestige of the Pope that he conferred upon them as senators, an aristocratic class of the city of Bologna. You can see that this portico is by no means an afterthought. The architect here, possibly Baldassare Peruzzi, has conceived of this entire aristocratic palace with the portico as a part of that design that cannot be separated. So this is absolutely a unit in the way in which it's been conceived. It's not just an afterthought on the outside of the building. And this is a period in which Bologna is really experimenting with its power thanks to the presence of the papal state and the jostling for position in the court that allows. We see the sponsorship of local artists, for example, the Carracci family, but you may also know the names Domenichino, Guido Reni. These are artists, the Fontana father and daughter, Prospero Fontana. We have one of his paintings in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and Isabella Fontana, Lavinia Fontana rather. So these two, father and son, this family of the Carracci from the centre of Bologna. In fact, they revolutionised painting in the 16th century and have an enduring impact, in fact, on painting in Rome as well. So you may know their work, for example, from Palazzo Farnese in central Rome. They reconceive things like, for example, the role of landscape in painting in Italy. So they're very significant, and we wouldn't have had the patronage of those families without this aristocratic court established in Bologna by the Pope. As I said, nevertheless, this is papal occupation is often thought to have been a stifling period for Bologna in some ways, overly spiritual, but without that spirituality, we wouldn't have one of the most beautiful porticos in the whole city, which is over 4 kilometers long and runs from the center of Bologna to a very old but redesigned sanctuary on top of a hill outside the city of Bologna. That's the sanctuary of San Luca, and you can still walk the entire length of this portico. A procession still walks the entire length of this portico to get up to the sanctuary every year. This is one of the most beautiful and ingenious porticos in terms of its design. Elegant, logical, space-saving, all of the things that you want in urban infrastructure such as this. So I'll leave its architectural merits to the discussion shortly with Michael. Bologna's modern history begins, as so much of Italy's modern history begins, with the arrival of Napoleon, who takes this city in 1796. One of the things he does that has a reference point for us with respect to the porticos is that he decrees that burials must take place outside of the city. We have the construction of a huge charter house, the Certosa, or the refounding of a charter house, the Certosa, outside of the city. This is where that Etruscan bronze urn, the Situla, was discovered in this graveyard, quite fittingly. And so we also have a long portico that links the city to the monumental cemetery so that families could go and tend the graves of their family members. This is the portico stretching from the centre of Bologna out to the Certosa, with now snugly alongside it the stadium, still the Stadium of Bologna, which was constructed in fact in the fascist era as the Stadio Littoriale, with the Torre Maratona that you can see there, that modernist design. After Napoleon comes, with some struggle, the unification of Italy. We see in the centre of Bologna an urge to make Bologna into a miniature Turin, eventually the capital of the newly unified Italy. So we have very beautiful neoclassical porticos in Piazza Cavour in the centre of the city of Florence, with these Pompeian-inspired frescoes outside, for example, the Banca d'Italia. But this way of building porticos has become reflexive for the people of Bologna. So even when, for example, in 1917, a large bread factory is built just on the outskirts of the historic centre of Bologna in order to be able to mill and bake enough bread for the city's population, a portico is added onto this factory as well. And in fact, in World War I, the poor and hungry of the city of Bologna would wait under this portico outside the bread factory in order to receive their rations. So the other thing to keep in mind is the social dimension of these porticos, the kind of social space that they have offered. And this portico is now outside the bread factory, has been turned into Bologna's Museum of Modern Art, which houses the preeminent collection of local sculptor Giorgio Morandi. And finally, as I said, the porticos have become reflexive. So, for example, when the city is in dire need in the 50s and 60s of more public housing, the architect chosen to work on that project, Vaccaro is his name, he envisaged what is known colloquially as the train, 600 metres of a curved porticoed residential building in cement, where each resident gets essentially a slice of this building. So they have the balcony up the top and then the 2 floors underneath in very regular kind of units, which nevertheless snakes its way. I mean, it's just extraordinary from the air, isn't it? Just snakes its way 600 metres in length through the heart of what was a new residential housing district, the area of the Barca, which has also been included on the listing. And finally, those who study in the city of Bologna, well, the porticos get into their veins as well. So you may be familiar with Pierluigi Nervi's work in Australia at places like Australia Square, or also on some of our national buildings in Canberra. But in fact, he studied in the city of Bologna, and this is his extraordinary design for a now abandoned tobacco factory on the outskirts of Bologna, where he studied architecture as a student. And you can see that the porticos got into his veins here as well, because here he is reimagining a tobacco factory as a porticoed space for the workers of the city of Bologna as well. So that was a canter through the history of Bologna and the porticos and their role in it. But now Michael is going to unmute. Remember, you're very welcome to send through any questions that you might have in the chat. But now Michael and I are going to discuss some of the more expansive, or shall we say thematic aspects of the porticos and the reasons for which they were considered for this UNESCO World Heritage listing. So Michael, was there anything in particular that you wanted to start with in terms of considerations? Michael, I can't hear you. You might need to, there you go.
The sound?
Got you now.
Okay. Thank you for having me, everybody. Thank you for a brilliant presentation, Kathleen. It really warmed me up to the topic, and I cannot believe you were able to summarize so succinctly that amount of material. You're a marvel. And a thought that came to me while you were presenting, particularly in the second half, I thought, well, if you're an architect, how do you design formally? Above all, you design in terms of the weight and the silhouette and the types of materials you use, but you also design visually with an old form of drawing called sciography, where you're understanding a building in terms of its light and its shade. And for pre-modern periods, light and shade was recession and projection. That is, a recession, partly covered, causes a shadow, and a projection taking the full face of the sun causes a lit area. And porticos are models of projections and recessions. So there's one way to think about porticos, which sort of just came to me while you were talking tonight, was that in their own way, they're models of the process of architectural design, simplified models of the process of architectural design. And you also said another thing, and I think it was almost an aside, where you were referring to the entrance to, was it the university or a place where students gather?
Mm.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that's happened in architecture over the last 40 or 50 years is the integration of circulation theory, derived probably from urbanism at large, into the way architects think about buildings. And circulation theory is just a great aspect of architecture for those who aren't architects, just those who want to look at it from a side. And we can think about the circulation that occurs through the city, but also the circulation that occurs through an individual building. And the individual building might be like a model in miniature of how the city operates. Now, within that, circulation is everything. It's the life of the city. And Louis Kahn said famously, the street, it could be the corridor, it could be the portico, is a place of human agreement. I also think, where do people gather and have a chat? As you said, in porticos. They also do it in stairwells. So maybe stairwells are sort of like porticos inside a building. They do it in front of entrances. Porticos lead you to entrances. And they do it in front of public bathrooms, so toilets as well. Classic place for a chat, because usually you're waiting to get in. And if you're waiting to get in and it's an outside toilet, it's best if there's a portico. Also, a portico, even though it doesn't shield you completely, it gives you that little bit of privacy that you want if you're standing waiting to use the loo. Can we have a, just go on to the next image?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, Kathleen.
No, here you go.
I was speaking a little bit on the fly there, so we'll go back to what
No, it's great. Keep flying, keep flying.
Yeah. You were about to say something, Kathleen, before
I was going to say it was a kind of a flippant aside, but I'm hearing that now that those of us who are allowed to picnic can picnic, that in fact the kinds of conversations that people used to have while lining up to go into the bathroom at a pub or a nightclub on a busy night are now the kinds of conversations that people are having outside the toilets in public parks in Sydney. So maybe we need some porticos so that we can have safe spaces in which we can, physical distance in our current circumstances.
I mean, I said porticos. I was being partly flippant, but also there's a sense in which it's a form of public amenity that seriously goes to the amenity of the city. And on that score, let's start by looking at not a Bolognese image, but something that's related. It's of the time of the Renaissance images that you showed. It's a painting possibly by Luciano Laurana, The Ideal City. And we don't even know the title of this, frankly. It could be a prototype painting for a theatre set, for example. That would make sense, in which case it probably is the prototype for a tragedy. There's something of high moral importance, and high moral importance is indicated by the fact that this is the centre of the city, the place for serious human action, and there's nothing but important buildings there. So there's no satirical, low elemented buildings there, and there's no scramble of flora and fauna, for example. It's all serious stuff here. Now, what's apparent, which I'd never noticed until I was invited to participate tonight, was that flanking the most important building in the city, which could be seen as a baptistry, central sacred building, are two buildings, one presumably private and one public, that are both porticoed. They're components, in other words, of ideal civic form. And as Liz Farrelly reminds us every week, you should all read Liz Farrelly's article on Saturday morning. She's a terrific writer. I think she's a great writer about architecture because she's always connecting architecture to its ethical meaning. And she always has in mind that cities, and Sydney in particular, should strive to be the best version of what it can be. And I suppose what tonight's presentation reveals is that porticos are the visual embodiment of the ideal of a city. And in this one here, we've got a private space on one side with a component of its space given over to the public realm. And then we've got on the other side, the public building, which could possibly be a building that's occupied by bureaucrats and politicians and town councillors and so on, also has an interface space in which the public life of the citizenry and the government administration can visually mix. And in that sense, porticos fit within the concept of interface. What's really interesting, though, for me, and this sort of came to us in our discussion the other night, is that we can even think of a veranda, which is what we see on the building on the left at the top. We can even see a veranda as a type of portico, in the sense that, yes, it's not leading anywhere other than to the spaces of the building. It doesn't really fit the definition of a portico that we've explored. But if we think of an individual building as a microcosm of the larger civic meaning of Bologna, of Florence, of wherever we're talking about, of Sydney, then these types of spaces can be seen as alleyways, streets in the air, which is how Le Corbusier called them. He imagined his connecting corridors would be like streets in the air. And they too have an interface quality in which what goes on in them is not quite private. You better behave yourself. You put on the right clothes when you're there, and you can witness the spectacle of the city, but you can also be seen as part of the spectacle of the city, because buildings look at the city, but they also get looked back at.
But Michael, the thing that strikes me is, as you say this, and I nod and I agree, and I think about the kind of democracy of space that the portico allows for us to move in and move out, be private, be public, be high, be low, be all of those things. Yet this image that you've chosen, which is such a beautiful example of porticos, of Renaissance town planning, of the ideal kind of microcosm of the city, there's no people. There's not a single person here, Michael, not even in the windows. So in that sense, what do we make of this theatre of the city when it's devoid of actors?
Yeah, this is why this is a very peculiar sort of painting. Certainly it has a destination or a purpose, which is not apparent just from its title. It's definitely not just a picture of an ideal city. It's connected to things like appropriate theatre decoration. So theatre decoration, backdrops to theatre, typically had spaces, architectural spaces, landscape spaces that are not people. The peopling of them goes on in the theatre that takes place on the actual stage. It could also be a demonstration of perspective, or at least that's certainly part of it. So I'm not too worried by the lack of people in it, to be honest. Where you would expect people to be in something like this is just for the sake of scale, but the scale is provided by the windows and the doors.
That's true. And you chose for us another beautiful example of a portico space where actors are certainly present.
Yeah. See, and when we're talking thematically like this, you realize how good a painter who's sometimes just regarded as a picturesque artist, Canaletto, is, that in fact buried in his work is a deep understanding of the theatre of the city. So that we see the various roles that porticos play here, not haphazardly. You can be certain that Canaletto is trying to demonstrate the role of porticos in modern life, but not by altering what's actually there, just by highlighting selectively a sufficient number of aspects of the porticos. So again, this concept of the ideal city can be removed. And he does it so well. And he also does it in terms of the people that are pictured in the piazza. They don't repeat each other. Each group sort of represents a type or a social situation. But I'm really struck with, in this context, something that I hadn't noticed before, the centrality of the idea of a portico in demonstrating what an actual city is like in its ideal form. And that's the challenge for Canaletto, to show us the ideal, but not do it so explicitly that you don't think what you're looking at is actual reality. Great painter. Let's look at another one.
Well, I was just going to say that you spoke about the actors on the stage and the peopling of the scene. And one of the things that was pointed out in the UNESCO submission was the way in which Bologna has this vast quantity of porticoed squares. And this is a porticoed square that we're looking at in Venice as well. And in some ways, this kind of funnels for me, the function of the porticos here, aside from the fact that they're administrative buildings on either side, so they serve a function as well, but they really funnel your vision, and they still do this when you go to Venice as well. They funnel your vision down towards St. Mark's at the end. They're this extraordinary kind of guiding line for the eye to look at the big action, which in this case is St. Mark's Square. But the origin of them is so humble. So you, for example, had selected this image for us to look at, which is, you know, maybe the oldest surviving portico in Bologna, with those modern struts of brick added to support those extraordinary oak beams from the 13th century. I mean, this is as far from Canaletto as you can get.
Yeah. But if you're a building nerd, which I am, who just likes the way things are made, this has got to be the picture for you, doesn't it? A 9-meter high oak beam, oak column. That's incredible. Just the boldness of the disparate scale. It's just whatever it is that a building needs to have to be really exciting. This is it. So I think it's a good start, but it makes the point also very dramatically that the humble origin of the portico is just the alienation of public land by some greedy private owner. And the alienation of public land by greedy private owners is part of the life of cities. It happened in Sydney in the 19th century, early 20th century. It happens throughout the history of Rome, with which I'm most familiar. And it's happened in Bologna, and this then gets converted over time to a noble institution of civic building. And what's really striking too is that moment in, when is it, 1288, where they declare porticos compulsory, but they also declare the compulsory construction of porticos to take place on private land. So owners must set back their buildings and sacrifice, you know, probably a couple of meters depth to provide a portico, and that's a serious amount of space.
But I suppose they get a cellar underneath as part of the bargain, because something that we haven't said is that in Bologna, a lot of, and not in this case, but in a lot of those more imposing, you know, Renaissance porticos through into the Baroque, in Bologna, the outer wall of the portico actually keeps going underground and forms a cellar for the building underneath. So I suppose you give up some meters in the setback and give them over to a public passageway, but you gain a nice generous cellar or storeroom, whatever you need underneath. So there's some kind of quid pro quo happening, I suppose.
Yeah, and there are other benefits as well. If you're running a business, you get a space from which to declare your goods. I think we had a lovely 13th century.
We had a question about this as well, in fact, Michael. So someone asked if the porticos were used for trade as well.
Yep. So the use of porticos for trade is one of the ongoing aspects of the history of porticos wherever they are, not just Bologna, and it's a tense issue. So they are wonderful spaces for trade because the goods kept dry and all those sorts of things, but porticos can quickly be cluttered with trade. And there's, at least in the history of Rome, the history of porticos is a history where periodically there are public laws limiting their use of trade because of the cluttering aspect. And with cluttering comes nefarious activity as well. So trade that's illegal, like prostitution, for example.
I'm jumping to this one. I'm anticipating, sorry, Michael. I know that you think about that in relation to one of the most celebrated portico on the exterior of a building. And we also had a question about how the porticos in Bologna might have emerged from the Roman architectural tradition. So maybe you want to address that in relation to this.
I do, but I want to come back to that. At this point, I just wanted to observe something about this famous image of the Pantheon and its portico, is that it's got a fence on it. And fences were common on Roman porticos in the 18th century, directly in response to these problems of public amenity being overwhelmed by commercial use. And of course, they've all gone now, these fences. Could we just, did I want to go back? Yes, I did. I wanted to go back to that image of the Casa Isolani because we talked about, the benefits that a private owner gets from a portico, and they do get benefits. But let's face it, the commercial impact of setting back a property, say your property is 30 square meters, you're giving up 10%. That's a huge amount. We've got to face the fact that it does turn out to be a really substantial giving up of private wealth to the Commonwealth. And in that sense, the word that's important to understand this is magnificence. It contributes to what was called the magnificence of the city. And so even though it's not, you wouldn't say it was programmatic at the start, it was almost accidental. It's quickly overwhelmed by the broader theory of ethics, civic ethics, derived from Aristotle's theory of spending, and Book 4 in particular, where a building has to connect with the amplification of the common good. And this is so obviously in a public building, but even in private buildings. People are not free, especially if they've got money, just to live luxuriously. The front of the building in particular has to contribute to the decorum of the magnificence of the city. And I think Bologna is actually, now what I did with my mentor, Peter Cohane, a long study on the history of decorum. Bologna has to be the most decorous city that I can think of in those terms. If we understand decorum as being that aspect of architecture that is not concerned with the individual building, but with the larger context of the city.
Sorry, I'm just looking at the messages that we have. So we do have some questions.
Yep.
Can I pose you a question, and we might use that as a way for you to talk about something else as well? And that is, I know that you'd like to talk about one of the great architects of porticos, and that is Andrea Palladio, who designs porticos that are not porticos. And we've had this question about
Is this a Dorothy Dixer?
Pardon?
Is it a real question or a Dorothy Dixer? I can't believe this question. This is like I wrote this question. Who wrote this question?
Well, the question is about the origin of the porticos in Bologna. Do they emerge from the Roman tradition of porticos outside a building? And when I think of porticos outside buildings in Italy, I think of the Pantheon, and then I think about all of the buildings of Palladio that kind of derive from that model of the Pantheon. So what's the relationship between all of those things?
Well, why don't we go and have a look at the Pantheon then to get this up? Because this is now, we're getting into architectural terminology and categories.
Yeah.
And really the porticos of Bologna, they're called the porticos of Bologna. Porticos, they remain, they connect with portico theory. But in one way, I would think of them as corridors and keep this as an idea of what a portico is. It's a prostyle, a projection from an individual building that you head towards, you don't pass along. And heading towards it, you're basically, the portico is saying, come over here, come towards me. I am a threshold that splices itself between the profane space of the city and the sacred space of the temple. And when you get under me, you can pause, you can take your hat off, you can clean your hands if you want, you can get ready to enter sacred space, but you can also pause to thank the institution for building such a public commodity, and then you can turn around and face the city from which you've just left, in a way, to look back. So in that sense, these porticos of, say, the Temple of Pantheon, they're very famous, and they're the true porticos. And what's interesting is the way in which these meanings of the porticos nevertheless start to apply to what we might, in strict architectural terms, call colonnaded corridors, because all of those issues of the theatre of occupying a space, the looking back at the city from which you've left, that all applies, as Stefano Accorsi brought out so poetically in that introduction, to the corridors of Bologna. I think I've got another image just after this. What is that? And that it should be of Palladio, in fact.
We do have Palladio. We have Palladio here.
Yeah. So that person who asked that question surely knows that porticos are applied to the front of Palladio's building in antis, so that they're pushed back onto the facade. And if you stand directly in front of them, in your imagination, you can imagine that portico as projection. But in fact, it's just flat on the facade. When you stand and look at it as at an angle, indeed, the flatness of the facade becomes apparent. But stand in front and you see that's what Palladio has in mind, this idea that a building this idea that a building imply the existence of a portico that is possibly not practical in fact. And then when you see something like this Andrea Palladio's Redentore, one of his great designs, you realize that buildings are never isolated from the context of the city, and to truly understand them, you have to understand their use within, not just within the day-to-day, but the processional history of the city. So this projected portico that's flat on the facade, that's understood as a projection when you take the right aspect, that's Palladio's term, take the right aspect. Until then, almost don't look at the portico. Take the right aspect, and then turn up on the day of the Feast of the Redeemer, and then a barge causeway will have been built. It's not normally there, and people will be processing along to the portico, and then you see the portico in full action. It's like a catcher's mitt for citizens or the devotee or the congregation to move towards it. And you see how architecture is actually connected to the daily life of the city. If we go to the...
Yeah, but just as a comment, something that blew me away when you and I were talking about this before we came tonight was that you commented that Palladio had wanted to install a portico in the city of Porticos in Bologna, you know, the city we know for porticos more than any other Italian city. So I just wondered if you could maybe share that with people, because I found that so interesting.
So one of the great architectural historians of 20th century, James Ackerman, did a beautiful article, I think it's in the mid-50s, on Palladio's Lost Portico project for San Petronio in Bologna. And this story is an anomaly. It only reveals by exception what we've been saying. Palladio actually worked in Bologna, the city of porticos. Palladio loves porticos. So he's thinking, Bologna will love porticos on Petronio, the most important church, bar the cathedral. And that's what we're seeing there. You can see that facade there, it's like someone pulling their pants up and haven't completed the job. That's how facades are built. They're often the last thing that are built, and they're just dressing on the brick building. So Palladio in the mid-16th century imagines that a portico projecting the facade will be appropriate, one, because it's in Bologna, the city of porticos, and two, because porticos projecting from the surface in the manner of the pro-style Pantheon is what you do on grand churches, particularly in the mid-16th century. I think if we've got the next image, it shows that every one of the major churches of Rome in the time of Palladio's design for San Petronio has a projecting portico. They're actually modest affairs, many of these. They're almost lean-tos, but they're porticos nevertheless, and they do all the sorts of things that we talk about porticos doing. They interface, they provide a threshold, they provide comfort from the elements and all those sorts of things. But when we go back to San Petronio, the Bolognese rejected it and said, no, porticos are appropriate on public buildings, not on, secular buildings, not on sacred buildings. And I should say that if only they had known about the future research I would do on the topic in 300 years' time, they would know how wrong they are on that matter. So it's a real anomaly, this episode, strange one. And Palladio, one of his masterworks would have been the portico on San Petronio.
It's kind of impossible, really, to envisage that square being closed off. And I think it would have such a closing effect on that square.
Yeah, look, they're probably,
space, that square.
Even if their reasoning was wrong vis-a-vis the theory of porticos, in the case of Bologna, it might be right. There's another great principle in design, which is counterpoint. You want something important in a civic context to really pop. And had a portico been built on the front of it, particularly if it aligned up with the porticos elsewhere in the square, the blending effect, the unifying effect on the piazza as a whole could have been too great. And San Petronio doesn't pop as it now pops. Also because it weirdly never had its facade completed.
Michael, we're getting a lot of questions about the use of porticos in other places, in other traditions, for example, in ancient Greece and in the Muslim tradition as well, with the kind of arcades that we see within mosques. And I'm just going to put those out there for everyone's benefit, because they're very interesting questions and comments, but we don't really have time to address them. So I
confess I've never been to Greece, and so obviously Greece is what you study if you study architecture, right? And so I'm aware that Greece exists and porticos are important on ancient Greek buildings, but I just wouldn't want to speak to them because I'd probably get it all wrong.
So, Michael, we actually need to hand over imminently to Lillo so that he can farewell us, give us the envoy out into our
Okay,
evening.
but can we
yes,
do our
exactly.
grand finish?
Yes. What's your final? What would you like to choose?
Well, let's look at some. What do we have after this? We had.
Well, let's think about maybe porticos that we're more likely to see while we're not allowed to leave the country. So maybe you'd like to finish with two Australian vernacular.
Yeah, if you're hankering for a portico after tonight, and you're living in Sydney, or if you're living in Goulburn, even better still, or if you're living anywhere near the architecture of the great James Barnett, the New South Wales colonial architect in the 19th century, you'll find porticos aplenty, and they're influenced by Bologna and other places as well. Venice he loved, the Piazza of San Marco he loved, but he is the most Italian of all New South Wales government architects, and perhaps he's one of the most Italian of all colonial architects, full stop. He's a student of the great Charles Robert Cockerell, and no one, this is, I don't want to claim connection to Barnett, but I know about all this because of Peter Cohane. He's my mentor. Peter Cohane studied Charles Cockerell. Charles Cockerell emphasized how the Italian architectural tradition, which I'm saying is embodied by Bologna, emphasizes the connection between the citizen and the city. And that's what you get in the GPO with this beautiful portico down below, directly modeled on the type of corridored public-private spaces of Italy. And as well as a bonus, if you're an Italophile, you'll get to see carvings in the spandrels done by Italian sculptural masters like Tommaso Sani, who came to Australia especially to work on the GPO.
Well, Michael, I think you and I have now proved that we could talk about porticos for longer than.
Oh, aren't we going to show the final image?
You can have one more, and then I need to hand back over to Lillo. So here's the final image, Michael.
So the UNESCO nomination text put the Porticos of Bologna in the widest possible context and considered awninged streets as well. And I thought that was a great way to finish, because awninged streets are a blessing for Sydney-siders for obvious reasons, but walking down them, it's nice to think that you're actually putting yourself within the physical context of the wider view of an ideal city that would be exemplified by somewhere like Bologna.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for an invigorating chat and for giving us the opportunity to feel like we're in Bologna the next time we get to walk down King Street, Newtown.
I shouldn't shout out to anyone, but the one name that strikes me, I can see it right there, is Maisie Stapleton, who I worked for her in my first job.
Oh,
and there she is attending. It's amazing. That was 35 years ago.
Shout out.
Yeah, at the National Trust.
Thank you, Michael, and grazie Lillo. We'll hand back over to you now, or we'll just keep talking about porticos. Thank you, Lillo.
So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kathleen, for such amazing conference. We are starving for Italian culture, and sure we will be back there soon as is possible. I thank all for participating to this event. And we will see soon in October, when we will have a lot of events dedicated to the Dante Alighieri during the Italian Language Week. So thank you again all for coming virtually, and thank you again. Bye bye. Ciao ciao, arrivederci.